Okay, guys, now we have episode number 7 coming up. The title is Appunti da Padova. And we'll first start with the monologue, of course, and then go into cross-Atlantic crosstalk with Arun and Julia and Ellie. The topic will be about Israel. Then we'll go into...
Okay, look, I hate to interrupt or whatever, but let's talk about what's really going on, which is notes. Okay? We're giving notes, we're getting notes, Nomi has notes, other people have notes. Notes are fine, okay? But what's not okay is this rumor that someone, probably Julia Doubleday, started that I'm a diva. Okay, I can take notes. I am not thin-skinned. I am thick-skinned. I am humble. I am all of those things and a bag of chips. So let's just be clear. Notes.
Okay, good, because I have a couple one for you.
Who sent you?
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida, sacrificarse hasta la muerte en los campos de batalla de todos los continentes del mundo.
Transcribed from Padova in Italy, it's the Committee Program, the chronicle of the world's most mysterious global political strategic entity. On today's show, Monday, June the 14th, Ellie Mayohagan, Hassan El-Tayyab, Aisha Jumaan, Shireen Al-Adeimi, friend of the show, Lizz Winstead, and the Deputy Director of Committee, the show's own Julia Doubleday, and the rest of the committee gang. And now a man who exhibits zero diva behavior of any kind and is by far my favorite boss, Arun Chaudhary.
Thank you, Jacopo. I do think, though, that when I write those lines that are kind of personal about me for you to say, that you need to inhabit it with something from your past that reminds you of this kind of wonderful relationship you have with your boss so that you can inform it with real feelings. It's called the method.
Absolutely.
It's called the method, and it's how you take your acting up to that next level. So I hold in my hand here, similar to last week when I was holding up in my hand something I was excited about, I am similarly excited that we have notes from Nomi Key, from the boss, from the boss's boss, and she wants us to do some things differently. And one thing that she wants is for us to start explaining things. And so I thought we would maybe use some of this monologue time to explain a couple things that are going on. But we don't have a lot of time for that. So what I'm hoping is that maybe we'll do a couple and maybe we'll do them for 60 seconds. Jacopo, can we get 60 seconds on the board?
Yes, we do.
Okay, count it off for me.
3, 2, 1.
Count it off in Italian. Let's make this an occasion.
Okay. Allora, 3, 2, 1, vai.
Okay, so there were elections in Germany, in Saxony, which is a part of Germany you've probably heard of, but it's actually part of Saxony-Anhalt, so it's, one thing, that are considered bellwether elections for the national election that are coming up next year. When it comes to the national election, we'll have a lot more to say, but it breaks down basically to the CDU, who are a center-right but big tent party of Angela Merkel, the quote-unquote leader of the free world. But she, of course, they picked Laschet to follow her. He's not as popular. So seeing how they did in this election was important to see how they'll do in that election. Now, but, Jacopo, the thing is, the competition there is not the Greens, which it is nationally, where they're actually very close, and in fact were leading for a while, Baerbock. But it's actually they're running against the AfD, who, because we don't have that much time to explain, are Nazis. So more people went for the conservatives than went for the Nazis, and therefore we are saying that we think that people feel like it's okay to vote for the conservatives in the election they're coming home. Thank you.
That was almost perfect, yeah.
No, I thought that, I think we'll consider that perfect. That's within the margin, okay? So if we're measuring other ones by, all right, let's see how someone else does. Let's bring in Julia. Okay. Let's have Julia do Peru. Yeah, bring her in. Julia, hi.
Julia.
Hello.
What time is it where you are?
It's a time that I'm not usually awake, and that's all you need to know about it.
Well, what we're doing is a very high energy thing, and I feel like you're extremely ready for that, which is because Nomi wants more explainers. We're going to explain stuff. We don't have a lot of time. 60 seconds. Would love to hear you explain to the folks what happened in Peru last Sunday at the same time as this election in Saxony was happening. Let's get 60 seconds on the board, Jacopo. Per favore.
Ok.
Oh, God.
60 secondi. 3, 2, 1, vai.
This Sunday in Peru, we had a battle between the far left and the far right, with Pedro Castillo representing the left. He's a farmer, trade unionist, and teacher who ran on a platform of nationalizing resources as well as reducing and eliminating poverty in Peru. He was up against Keiko Fujimori, the daughter of former dictator Alberto Fujimori, currently serving a 25-year sentence for corruption and crimes against humanity. The two of them had an almost unbelievably close outcome in this race. It still has not been called by international press, but analysts on the ground say Fujimori does not have a path to victory, with Castillo up by over 100,000 votes in rural areas, and the remaining areas to be counted are also Castillo country in the rural parts of Peru. So Fujimori is already alleging fraud, and we need to keep our eye out and ensure that the OAS and US do not support these claims, which have no basis in reality on the ground.
Yes, excellent. And I think that's last thing especially, right? Like fans of the show will know that exactly now is when bad things happen. And ambassadors are making phone calls and things are happening that we care not even to think about. But this was good. This went well. I mean,
Okay,
we'll
we're
have to
never doing
discuss
that
whether
again.
writing things down is within the spirit of the exercise, you know? But I think we can go either way. Maybe we can include some other folks in this. But let's go into Cross-Atlantic Crosstalk. Hi, and welcome to Cross-Atlantic Crosstalk. With us, we have the gang, Ellie Mayo-Hagan, our show's own Julia Doubleday. But we have a new format because Nomiki had some notes, and we are implementing the notes. And that per the notes, there will be clips. There will be clips, and sometimes we'll react to them, and sometimes they'll illustrate something for you that maybe you weren't able to catch on European television or some other media that you couldn't see. But anyway, first I want to start with something that maybe is the cause of global progressive worldwide celebration, which is the 15% corporate tax that was talked about in the G7.
What you're seeing is a revival of multilateralism, a willingness of leading nations in the G7 and the G20 to cooperate to address the most critical challenges facing the global economy. And this international tax race to the bottom has been a problem for many, many countries for decades.
I mean, Julia, is this something that we're excited about? Is this a nice counterpoint to what has been regressive foreign policy in many ways?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I feel, something we talk about on the show all the time, and almost the underlying idea behind the show is that there need to be these international boundaries that apply to corporate actors and apply to the super wealthy, and right now there just aren't any. So the result of that is there is this race to the bottom where no nation is able to implement the laws they would like to implement to rein these corporate actors in, because when they do, they're punished economically. So beginning the process of having boundaries and having rules and having a conversation, a dialogue between different countries about how we can actually work together to rein in corporate actors and reclaim some sovereignty, I think is absolutely crucial. Obviously, we're in the early phases of negotiating this deal, but it's a really great sign of things to come, I think.
And it's happening alongside another negotiation that was already ongoing that is the same idea, but has carve-outs, you know, like fishing and shipping, and for the UK, of course, their financial industry. Dun, dun, dun. Ellie, how is this playing in the UK? Which, of course, is hosting the G7.
As a victory for the Chancellor everyone loves to love, Rishi Sunak. So he's sort of declared this is his victory, even though I would say that's sort of definitely over-egging it, because I think that our government was one of the more resistant ones to it. But yeah, so partly that, and partly obviously there's been some tensions between Biden and Johnson because of Johnson being really into Trump and also maybe trashing the Good Friday Agreement. So the other element has been like lots of photos of Carrie, now I think she's now Johnson, and Boris Johnson, and Joe and Jill Biden sort of going for walks on the beach together, which I think is
special relationship.
Yeah, exactly, which I'm pretty sure that only Britain cares about. I don't know if like Americans care as much about that as we do. But yeah, so basically that's how it's sort of come across here. And I would say that I actually have done quite a lot of work with the tax justice sector in this country. And I think the way that they see it is that it's not good enough, but that it's like a huge victory that it's even happened at all, because even 6 months ago, you know, it was seen as something that was just impossible to achieve. So
it's an Overton window kind of victory, like at least we're talking about it, even if nothing else.
Yeah, exactly. And it's sort of happening. It's basically, it's like broken through a sort of seal, if you like. It's something that was called impossible has now become possible. And I know that you haven't asked this, and I feel a bit like loath to talk about the Labour Party, but it does have
we always seem to. Let's do it.
Yeah. It does have interesting implications for the Labour Party, because, you know, like where they can outflank the Conservatives is on sort of radical economic transformation. But obviously, like now, the Conservative government is doing things now that are more radical than what Labour did. That sort of puts the Labour Party in quite a difficult position. And there was actually some polling out today that showed that the Labour Party's ratings are worse than when they lost the 2019 general election. So that's the other side of it, is it does sort of, it continues to beg the question of what's the Labour Party for, that they're still not answering.
So let's get the second clip up, which is of Emmanuel Macron getting slapped.
French President Emmanuel Macron was slapped by a man while he greeted people in the southeastern Drôme region. You have that video right there, shocking video of that man slapping the president. He was immediately tackled by security forces. 2 people were arrested in connection with the incident. That is according to French media. We assume one of those people is the person who did slap the president. We do not know who that second person is.
So, listen, you know, I would never publicly advocate for throwing a pie or slapping a politician openly, because I would maybe get in trouble. But I do think that getting in politicians' faces, being outside their houses, making them uncomfortable is a crucial part of not just, you know, of political discourse, of democracy, of protest. What do you think about Macron getting slapped? I'm going to ask you first, Ellie, just because Boris Johnson is someone who takes a lot of verbal abuse at very close range on a pretty consistent basis. It's sort of one of his moves, even.
Yeah, I think with the Macron thing, I think I read that the guy who did it is like far right.
The police have released that he
like
medieval cosplays, lives with his mother, like. You know, I have no idea, and I do see it immediately as a bunch of details about him. But I think in the abstract, it's like, is it a spectrum between slapping someone and throwing a pie at them and, you know, having a group called Fuck Boris chase you around? Or, you know, in the post-January insurrection, are we more worried about our politicians? Should we have more security?
So I actually have I had a friend, and we didn't fall out, but I just didn't really see him anymore. But I had a friend who famously threw a pie at Rupert Murdoch. I don't know if you remember that. That after the hacking scandal in this country, he was sort of, I guess the American equivalent would be he was deposed by Parliament, and like Dominic Cummings was, that we talked about last week. And my friend sort of snuck into the deposition and shouted, "You naughty billionaire," and threw a pie at him and went to prison for 3 weeks for common assault. And I think the first thing I would say about that is obviously he shouldn't have gone to prison. What a ridiculous response that was. And second of all, he wouldn't have gone to prison if it was anybody else, which kind of suggests that a billionaire who, you know, whose wealth is private,
is entitled
and
to
is
something,
not, you know, a public servant. Yeah. And And also, I remember that at the time, the way that he explained it was, this is the only justice that he's ever going to get. And at the time, a lot of his sort of friends were a bit like, oh, you idiot. And we were also a bit annoyed with him because we were all part of the same activist group, and which was completely not related to the protest at all, and didn't like to the pie throwing, and didn't realise it was going to happen. But obviously it was reported as it being a sort of protest by this particular group that we were all part of. And so we were a bit annoyed with him for that. But, you know, that was sort of 7 years ago or something now. And
totally.
You know, he was right,
I think
actually.
a lot of people
like,
maybe would
he
have
hasn't
changed
faced any
on their
other
side
justice.
of the pie. It feels now more like Iraq when the fellow threw his shoe at George W. Bush. It was the only tool he had to actually be able to express his truth to the power in front of him, was his shoe. You know, he made it happen.
Yeah. And I think ultimately, like, I think obviously there's like a tradition of like theatre and this kind of like theatrical protest and theatrical like political campaigns. You know, we've got in this country, we've got like a tradition of if politicians won't agree to be interviewed, then one of our tabloid newspapers, The Mirror, chases them around London, like their intern will like chase them around London dressed as a giant chicken. You know, like, so that sort of silliness, particularly in Britain, has always been like a part of politics. But I do think ultimately it speaks to like a lack of agency. Like, people feel like there's no actual democratic channels through which they can change things.
I think that's...
So they like slap someone, or they like throw a shoe, or they throw a pie.
Julia, what do you think? I mean, especially in America, where, you know, people freak out.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Ellie, the old Martin Luther King quote, the riot is the language of the unheard. I think shoe throwing is also the language of the unheard, and the pie in the face is also the language of the unheard. I think, you know, if we have a democratic process that's working, where people feel that they have an outlet to be able to get representation, then it just doesn't come to that. So, you know, Macron getting slapped in the face, objectively funny. That's my high level analysis. But do I think that, you know, it's a tactic that works or doesn't work? I think it's, you know, something that draws attention. I think it's ultimately just an expression of frustration more than a tactic.
Totally. All right, last clip on the board. It is Ellie's husband's birthday, and we're making sure she gets out of here on time. And happy birthday.
I want to be clear to folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border. Do not come. Do not come. The United States will continue to enforce our laws and secure our border. There are legal methods by which migration can and should occur. But we, as one of our priorities, will discourage illegal migration. And I believe if you come to our border, you will be turned back.
So, Julia Doubleday. Kamala Harris, to my ears, sounds like she is echoing Donald Trump policy, with the only difference being not even a kinder, gentler tone. She actually is using what I consider to be a fairly strict tone, but in that it has changed from things like "we'll lock you up" to "you'll get locked up," sort of this passive voice, something will happen. But so what am I missing? Because I'm only cursorily looking all the way over here from Berlin.
I mean, I think you're correct. I think, you know, I have a lot of feelings about this clip. I think in the U.S., we, for some reason, under the reign of Trump, again, this is something that I was speaking about from the time that Trump was first elected, is that we insisted on casting Trump as an aberration and a total break from what came before him. And the reason that the Democrats were happy to do that is because they could paint him as this once-in-a-lifetime monster without looking at how they've contributed to the political reality we live in now. they also let the rest of the Republicans off with an easy pass. So the Republicans at large were happy to go along with this characterization as well. Trump is this thing we've never seen before. He's totally different from anything else. Even build the wall. Build the wall was, it's obviously a catchy slogan. It's something people started saying all the time. But it has history in this country of decades and decades and decades of politicians saying we need to, Hillary Clinton's words, I think, were construct a barrier. They didn't say build the wall because they weren't as exciting of a celebrity
honestly, build the wall is
as
much
Trump.
better. Much better.
It's a much better slogan. But, this idea that it was somehow more racist now because it was Trump, of course, like this history of immigration policy in this country has always been racist. None of this is a surprise. I think the thing that makes me angrier than Kamala's words, which weren't a surprise to me, is the press acting brand new about who Kamala is. So the press and her supporters acting like this is just totally weird that this would happen. This is the same press that continually pushes for the Democratic Party's choices to get into power. And as they're doing that, they provide cover for these people. They write articles that are like, why are people criticizing Hillary Clinton? It's probably because she's a woman. I mean, that was a huge refrain throughout the entire time Hillary was running, even though the critiques that Bernie supporters had of Hillary were very real critiques about her being a warmonger and her being a big advocate for fracking all around the world. That was like her big project as Secretary of State. And so many of her fans didn't know that because the press didn't cover it. They really painted a false picture of who Hillary Clinton was. And they've also done that with Kamala Harris. I mean, their coverage of her has just been nonstop, she's the first woman of color vice president. Obviously, that's a huge deal to a lot of people, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about what her credentials actually are and what her positions actually are. So this is completely in line with everything she's done in her career. It shouldn't be a surprise. Acting as if it's a surprise is sort of carrying water for the lies that they previously told.
And non-ideologically, just as a mechanics thing, I would say kind of her trip also feels like what happens when you just don't want to get in trouble every day and you don't actually have a through line of things that you want to communicate. And so you can like sort of muddle your way through every day, but then come out with a really unsuccessful sort of mishmash of a trip. And I mean, Ellie, did this translate at all across to you? I mean, the split screen test is always, TV can only handle two things at once. It feels like it's the G7 and whatever's happening domestically. And for you, that's the third wave, I would imagine, of COVID, not of like ska or something.
Yeah, no, it really, well, I haven't been looking out for it, but I also haven't seen it. So no, it really hasn't penetrated here at all. I think there's also a lot of like liberals in this country who are like immensely happy that like Joe Biden won. So, and that Kamala Harris, as Julia said, is
it's breaking multiple barriers
woman of color
once,
to be vice president. Yeah, so there's a sort of there's also not really an interest in reporting it from particularly like liberal publications because it's
I think that tracks. I think that makes sense, and I also think that. Please, Julia.
I was just going to say, I think it's also important to note that this was a speech she was giving in Guatemala. So this is not something she was saying to her audience of liberal white people in the U.S. who want to feel good about themselves that they're not racist.
It's being fed out.
She didn't get up on a stage in front of all those people and say, I'm going to go down to Guatemala and I'm going to say, do not come. Do not come here. Even though it's legal for you to seek asylum, there's a legal process for you to do that. Do not come. She would never say that to a U.S. audience. She said it in Guatemala. And this is, very common. These like bifurcated positions that these liberal politicians have. One for their base that makes their base feel like they're super woke and they're anti-racist, and then their closed door feelings about what actually has to happen, which is, I'm the adult in the room and this is how the world works.
Hypocrisy. We will end on it. Ellie, we know you have to go. Thank you so much for joining us. Julia, we'll speak to you later. Okay, hi. So you say that you've got notes. And guess what? I'm an open-minded, super cool, easygoing boss who loves notes.
Okay.
I'm going to write your notes down. I'm going to take notes on your notes.
Bravo.
Prego.
So, first thing, you have to to tell people to subscribe.
I totally disagree. I tell people to subscribe every time. I'm going to push back on that. But go ahead. What's the next one?
Well, then why don't you thank the guests? They're a busy person.
I thank look, that's a good note. That's a good note. I understand. I do it every single time. So I'm going to push back on that while acknowledging that. I'm going to acknowledge and push back. Do you have anything else?
Maybe for now not.
Okay, well, I haven't written anything down yet, so I hope that you're not offended. But you know, there's no reason why we can't have this conversation again later.
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida, sacrificarse hasta la muerte en los campos de batalla de todos los continentes del mundo.
Comite, comitato, comitiet, comiteto, corul. Committee, we young way, submittee, we committee.
Hey, real quick, you said the N is silent on one of them. Which one? I'm just gonna do all of them. Okay, forget. I'm just not gonna do any of the N's.
No N's.
That'll be fine. It'll be fine. Roll. Here we go. Hi, welcome back to the show, and welcome to your Global News Rodeo, our roundup of all the ooze that's happening all over the internet as set up and curated by our own Forrest Lovette. Let's go to item 1. Victoria del Castillo, leftist teacher, claims victory in Peruvian election. Pedro Castillo, the rural school teacher and union leader, has claimed victory in the Peruvian presidential election. Left Voice reports Castillo has garnered 71,000 more votes than his right ultra-conservative opponent, Keiko Fujimori. In the perfect sync of the right-wing populist playbook that you've learned about on this show and seen in action over and over again, editorializing, Fujimori has claimed election fraud and says Castillo's party is attempting to distort and delay the results which reflect the popular will. Peru took to the polls on June 6th, and the race remains too close to call. El País reports that Castillo has claimed victory with 97.8% of vote tallied, but the fight rages on with Fujimori plotting with Peruvian law firms to annul 100,000 votes that were cast for Castillo. I mean, you know, watch what the U.S. does. We will see. Item 2, Cosmopolitan Courts. The first Muslim American judge is confirmed. NPR is reporting that U.S. President Joe Biden has confirmed his first judges to the federal bench. Among the new appointees is Zahid Qureshi, who becomes the first Muslim federal American judge in U.S. history. His father emigrated to New York from Pakistan in 1970 and opened and ran a successful medical practice. For nearly 50 years, Qureshi, a graduate of Rutgers Law School, will now serve the U.S. District Court for New Jersey. The chairman of the American Pakistani Public Affairs Committee was quoted as saying he is a model for outstanding contributions that Pakistani and Muslim Americans make to this country every day. We are grateful to President Biden for nominating him and to the members of the Senate for confirming him today. Item 3, the slap heard round the world. Macron assaulted in public. Al Jazeera reports that Damien Terrell, the man who was caught on video slapping French President Emmanuel Macron last week, has been arrested and sentenced. Macron was shaking hands with onlookers as he made a visit to the region of Dome when Terrell landed a solid, open-handed slap to the masked Macron. It was great footage. We watched it earlier. The 28-year-old was immediately detained and now faces 4 months in prison. Many leaders have spoken out condemning the act, saying it's a symptom of the volatile social and political climate. Others see the slap as a representation of the vehement rejection of Macron's economic agenda and as a reminder that the animosity towards the president hasn't vanished since the Yellow Vest protests of 2018 and 2019. I do believe in a perfect world there is an anti-Macron progressive vote that could shoot the moon, but folks like Clement, who we talked to the other day, really have to be successful. I'm editorializing. I think at this point you know that. Item 4, resistance is futile. Iran's elections face boycott. Al Jazeera is reporting Iranian government has held its first presidential debate ahead of the June 18th election. The field of candidates was narrowed down to 7 and excluded several prominent figures, leading to a backlash. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, said in a video conference to those who do not pay attention to those promoting that voting is useless. Regime authorities and media outlets are expecting a record low turnout to the polls. Thousands have mobilized in 250 cities in a public display calling for a boycott of the election. However, the validity and the resistance is in serious question, given that it is campaigned by the People's Mujahideen of Iran, or the MEK, who are considered by many to be a cult and not a viable alternative for leadership, although you know what that means sometimes from time to time. Item 5, resignation with a silent N. Central African Republic African News reports that Firmin Grebada, the Prime Minister of the Central African Republic, has resigned. He resigned last Thursday along with his entire cabinet after serving as the country's prime minister since February 2019. The Central African Republic lies in the heart of the African continent and was formerly under the rule of France until 1960. The strained relationship with France is one of the reasons for the resignation. Officials from Paris announced they were suspending military assistance due to authorities in the Central African Republic being complicit in a Russian propaganda campaign against French diplomats. Rich in diamond mines, the country relies on Russian mercenaries to protect them. Russia has been present in the country since 2018. I actually don't know much about the situation. That sounds like a mess. I want to learn more about that. Item 6, oligarchy, obviously. Leaked documents show billionaires don't pay. The Socialist Worker reports an investigation by news outlet ProPublica revealed the world's richest 25 people paid criminally low amounts of taxes between 2014 and 2018. Big surprise, editorializing. Multi-billionaires such as Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, Elon Musk were all exposed to their tax avoidance. Buffett paid only 0.1%, Musk 3.7%. Bezos reported no federal taxes in 2007 or 2011 and also received thousands in tax credits for his children. The U.S. tax code does not require individuals to pay taxes on increase in wealth from assets, only from wages. Unfortunately, this means that 1%ers are technically not breaking any laws. President Biden has vowed to raise the top rate of tax, change the laws for tax inheritance, and double the tax on high-income earners. Yet the White House says the information leaking tax information should be illegal. We will see.
Travel forecast. Right now, your weekend travel forecast.
Regional conditions.
All right, Forrest. So, I'm taking notes. People are giving notes. Do you have any notes? Oh, you've got notes. Let me get something. I'll get something to write. Hello, and welcome back to the committee program. Today, we're actually going to be joined by 3 experts who are going to talk about the ongoing crisis in Yemen and a panel put together by the show's own Julia Doubleday. And it's going to be, I think, really interesting, and we're really excited to start. Julia, can you tell us what's on tap?
Yes. So to give some brief background, Yemen's civil war has been going on since 2014 when Houthi forces took over the capital city of Sana'a. A coalition led by Saudi Arabia then launched airstrikes in an attempt to restore the government. In the 7 years since, the nation has spiraled into chaos as splintered factions battle for power, and the U.S. continues to back the destructive bombing runs conducted by the Saudis. Adding to the crisis being experienced by Yemeni civilians on the ground are the effect of sanctions, attacks on a major port city, and an ongoing blockade that is leading to mass starvation and including and especially of children. Here to speak to us today about these crimes against humanity being committed against Yemeni civilians are Dr. Shireen Al-Adeimi, a Yemeni-American activist, assistant professor at Michigan State University, and a frequent contributor to the journalistic outlet In These Times. Aisha Jumaan, founder and president of the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Organization, and Hassan El-Tayyab, legislative manager for Middle East policy for the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Thank you all so much for joining us here today and sharing your expertise with us.
Thanks for having us.
I wanted to first speak with Shireen a little bit about more detail about the history of this conflict. So I've given obviously a very broad overview, but I'd like to hear from you why the U.S. got involved, what the U.S. has been doing since the inception of the conflict, as well as what the origins are for this conflict and how it's been developing over the last few years.
Thanks for having me. So the U.S. has been involved since 2015 when they essentially joined the Saudi-led coalition's bombing and blockading of Yemen in March of that year. I know you mentioned in your introduction that it's a civil war that began in 2014. I'm not sure I quite agree with that framing. 2014 is when the Houthis took over the capital Sana'a, and there was a lot of civil unrest following that. But even in those months of civil unrest, Yemenis were getting together and negotiating a resolution with a power-sharing, government, and that was disrupted by the Saudis. So just when they reached the UN mediated resolution, the Saudis began bombing 2 days later in 2015, along with the U.S. But prior to that, the reason Yemen was even in this time of civil unrest was because following the Arab Spring in 2011, so there were mass protests. People wanted a change in government. They toppled the dictator Saleh, who had been ruling Yemen for 30 odd years. But then the appointed transitional president Hadi failed to move the country forward in ways that were going to be exclusive to everyone involved. And so the Houthis were one such faction that felt that they were not being heard. And then following the, government had pulled some fuel subsidies in the summer of 2014. And in response, the Houthis took over the capital to apply pressure on President Hadi. So all of this could have been solved internally. Yemenis, like I said, had gotten together and negotiated a power-sharing government. But Saudi involvement in Yemen has a long history, and this is the most overt example of Saudi intervention. And this was also following the Iran deal, and where Saudi felt excluded from the negotiation. And so the U.S. was very eager to support the Saudis in whatever they called this mission, and they thought it was going to be a 2-week mission. But also the U.S. has its own interests in the region. Yemen is at the, this crossroads basically with Bab el-Mandeb Strait. So you've got a lot of international shipping going through to Europe, to U.S., to Asia. You've got 6.2 million barrels of oil and oil products per day traveling through that port. And the U.S. has always had a strategic interest in Yemen for that reason.
And can you elaborate a little bit about the type of support that the U.S. Is providing to Saudi Arabia?
So it's almost everything. The U.S. trains Saudi and Emirati soldiers and pilots. They provide, up until end of 2018, they were providing mid-air refueling. So jets that were bombing Yemenis, the U.S. would provide mid-air refueling for them. There's obviously tens of billions of dollars in weapon sales under Obama, Trump, and now Biden. There is a lot of kind of servicing of vehicles and aircrafts, even ones that are not sold by the US to the Saudis. And so, and of course, there is also support in the command room. So the US actually helps the Saudis choose targets. And every step of the way, essentially. I mean, it's not an American pilot, dropping the bomb, but the bomb is an American bomb. That pilot was trained by the US. His plane was refueled by the US. The target was chosen by the US. And so the US is involved almost every step of the way.
Well, I'd like to throw it over to Aisha now to discuss a little bit about the effects being felt on the ground. So what are we talking about in terms of numbers of people being affected by this humanitarian crisis? What are the effects of things like blockades and sanctions on civilians on the ground?
Yeah, Yemen has been called by the UN as the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. The Yemeni population is about 13 million people, and 21 million people are in need of assistance today. Of these, 12.1 million people are in need of assistance immediately to survive, and 4 million people in Yemen are displaced. The number of people who are hungry in Yemen is 16.3 million people. Of these, over 2.5 million people are children less than 5 years of age. The UN also said in February there are 400,000 Yemeni children who are at risk of dying within a few weeks to a few months because they are suffering very extreme famine. And that's in February. We are in June, and nothing has happened to improve the lives of those people. My suspicion is that many of these children would have died by now. We also, as you said, we have a blockade on Yemen, so it's a blockade on ports and airports and commercial flights coming in. And this was a purposeful measure that the Saudi-led coalition, with the support of the US, put in place when they started attacking Yemen in March of 2015. And the result of that, and the intention of that, was to destroy Yemen economy. I mean, if we look at the economy with COVID-19, how the closures have affected a lot of people, resulted in food insecurity, imagine having that for 6+ years in a row. So there's been a total destruction of the Yemeni economy and the livelihoods of many people in Yemen. Liz Grande, who was the UN humanitarian coordinator for Yemen, in her testimony in April to the US Senate, had said that this was the intention of the blockade on Yemen. And it's not just a blockade, so if you want to send money to Yemen, you cannot send money to Yemen. So they've really tightened every aspect to ensure that there is maximum hurt, maximum impact on the Yemeni population, and that's just really something that is a war crime. You cannot use famine, you cannot use food as a war tactic, and unfortunately that has been used in Yemen for over 6 years now. We're in our 7th year, and a lot of people have been impacted. For example, the central bank that was in Sana'a was moved in 2016 out of Sana'a, and as a result, a lot of the people, millions of civil servants, have not been paid salaries, and that includes healthcare workers, that include teachers. And we know that also from the destruction due to the airstrikes that many of the health services, only about 50% of the health services in Yemen are functioning. The other 50% are either totally destroyed or partially functioning. We also know that the water system in Yemen, the sewage system in Yemen, all the infrastructure had been destroyed. The Saudis purposefully actually targeted hospitals, and this is again an international, is considered a war crime. And if we just look at the centers, the health centers and facilities that are operated by MSF, which is Doctors Without Borders, about 5 of their centers were destroyed, including the cholera center on the day of its opening. Cholera in Yemen, we have the largest cholera outbreak in the world with over 2.3 million cases. It's a shame on humanity. It's a shame on all of us that in this time and age, we have a cholera outbreak that this large. We have a diphtheria outbreak that is highly infectious and also high fatality rate that affects children that's been raging in Yemen, unfortunately. Yemen has not had a diphtheria outbreak since 1980. Imagine that. We also now have a polio outbreak in Yemen. Again, polio, we're supposed to be ridding the world of polio. There is very strong international effort. Yemen had been cleared and certified polio-free for a long time until these atrocities that have affected the Yemeni infrastructure and the Yemeni population. Now we have a polio outbreak in Yemen. We have a dengue outbreak. I just got a call actually from a deputy minister of health in the south telling me that dengue is ravaging now in the southern governorates. Dengue has been ravaging all governorates actually for the last 5 years. So it's, if you look whether it's food security, if you look at livelihood, if you look at internal displacement, if you look at disease outbreaks, all of that had been destroyed. One thing I also want to point out is when the Saudis were also bombing, they bombed funeral homes, they bombed schools, they bombed everything, but they also targeted, big roads that connect and bridges that connect the capital Sana'a to the rest of Yemen. And Sana'a is landlocked. So by targeting the bridges and the roads that connect to Sana'a, the idea was you cannot bring food or fuel or anything to the country. So that's something that, again, if we look at war crimes, there are so much evidence that even Human Rights Watch had discussed that. There was also the bombing of the school bus with over 40 children dying. Many of them are less than 10 years of age. So however you look at it, and even the UN says Yemen is not starving, Yemen is being starved. And I actually agree with that statement. This is all done purposefully.
Yeah. And it's horrific seeing, as you say, all of these things purposefully come together to inflict harm. Hassan, you work on the legislative side, so can you tell us something specific about the U.S. policy? And it'd be interesting to know where Biden is actually differentiating himself from Trump, and also how legislation is going through Congress.
Thank you so much for hosting this conversation. I just want to say that Shireen and Aisha do quite a bit of advocacy too, and I think they're very much a part of this legislative process. Now, there's a lot there. So in February, there was this big, press release that was pushed out, an executive order by the Biden administration, basically saying that they had ended U.S. support for offensive operations in the Saudi-UAE-led war in Yemen. We were very thrilled to hear that. That's better than what we've been dealing with the Trump administration. But unfortunately, the devil's in the details. We didn't know what the difference was, according to Biden, what offensive and defensive actually meant. There wasn't really specification about that. And so Congress followed up and they asked a bunch of questions. Representative Khanna, Representative Fazio teamed up and they sent a letter to the administration asking about 13 or 14 really important questions about the blockade, ongoing support, the definitions between offensive and defensive weapons and support, maintenance for the warplanes, all of these questions. And we didn't really hear back. We got no clarification. And so that has sort of, that tells you a lot about where we are and where we need to go. So what has happened since is that Congress has followed up with that particular letter with several other statements. We had Representative Dingell, Pocan, and Khanna lead a 76-member letter calling on Biden to end the blockade. You heard what Aisha and Shireen said. We need to end this blockade, decouple it from ongoing negotiations. Starvation should never be used as a bargaining chip. And that's what we got a bunch of Democrats in the House to say. That was followed up by another letter by Chairman Meeks and Chairman Deutsch on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And they said the same thing: end the blockade, lift it as a humanitarian act, and do so immediately, irrespective of these ongoing negotiations. And then we had Senator Warren in the Senate follow up with a 16 senator letter effort, kind of going one step further, saying, we want you to not only call for an end to the blockade, we want you to use U.S. leverage to get this done. That means potentially weapon sales, putting those on the table, saying we're not going to sell you weapons anymore, Saudi Arabia, UAE, unless you lift the blockade. They didn't specify exactly what that was, but they made it clear to the Biden administration that they wanted them to use leverage. Unfortunately, while the administration has changed their tone on the blockade and on ongoing support, they definitely are now publicly saying that they want Saudi to end the restrictions on ports of entry. They're not being clear what they're willing to use as leverage, and that's where we need Congress to step in and pass a Yemen War Powers resolution to end all U.S. military support for the war in Yemen, to codify, the existing executive order that Biden put into place. Granted, we don't really know what that meant, but if that meant ending U.S. support for the war, let's get it into law. Let's get it, passed through both chambers, and then to get the Biden administration to actually sign that. So I think that's really key. There are other vehicles that, we could talk about, standalone legislation, attaching something to a must-pass bill. But right now, we're really focused on trying to force a Yemen War Powers vote, and that's a key legislative vehicle for a few reasons. But the main one is that we can force a vote without leadership support. And that's just absolutely critical, because if you introduce it, any member of the House or Senate can introduce this vehicle, and we can secure a vote on this particular bill within 15 legislative days. So that's what we're trying to do now, is to force the question. That's the biggest thing that I think folks right now in the advocacy community are pushing for, to kind of move this conversation along, because, in March, they said the World Food Program said 400,000 children were living with severe acute malnutrition in Yemen at that point, and that they would die without urgent assistance within weeks or months. And here we are in June. How many of those children have already needlessly died because of this ongoing blockade on all ports of entry by Saudi Arabia with U.S. support?
Yeah, I want to actually maybe drill down on a few things that you guys talked about. One thing, Hassan, that you mentioned is that in the executive order, it was unclear the distinction between offensive and defensive. And I think that's a really good thing to discuss a little further, because obviously, to most people, there should be a clear line between what's offensive and what's defensive. But for the U.S. and for other sort of aggressor countries in the past, we've treated, for example, the Iraq War, we painted that as being defensive because we thought, we claimed they had weapons of mass destruction. So in this case, it lends itself to ambiguity, calling the war defensive. So can you tell us why the Saudis are claiming that it would be defensive for them to be doing these bombing runs on this obviously, crippled, war-torn Yemen, and what's the pushback there?
So, there are rocket attacks, drone attacks that are going into Saudi territory. I'll just admit that there really haven't been, I think maybe one casualty in 6 years or so that has actually resulted from this. But they're claiming that those rocket attacks are part, what they're going after, and that they need to, kind of stop those attacks going into Saudi territory. But the reality is way different. One, The blockade is an offensive operation. That's hurting civilians, not Houthi commanders and officials. End of story. So that right there, that's why we're trying to drill down with the administration and let them know that we consider the blockade an offensive operation, and that's being enforced by U.S.-sold warplanes and naval vessels that receive ongoing U.S. support in the form of maintenance. And let's just drill down into that particular question, what this maintenance does. Nearly every time a Saudi warplane lands, these are F-15s that we've sold them, you need to replace a lot of spare parts, like tires, just all sorts of spare parts that need to be replaced on a daily or, almost daily basis. So that just goes to show you how dependent they are on that military support. There's right now an offensive that's been going on for over a year in the governorate of Marib. They're claiming that might be defensive, but really, that's not a threat to Saudi sovereign territory. They're just attacking Houthis in this, ongoing confrontation. For them to define some of these things as defensive is pretty absurd to me. And that's kind of why we need to keep the pressure on. I'll let Aisha and Shireen say more.
Yeah, I want to add here that we're not talking about defending U.S. From any Houthi attacks. There is no threat to the U.S. Like the case with WMDs was that this was going to be a threat to the United States at some point somehow. We're talking about defending Saudi Arabian territory. And somehow this is seen as a completely acceptable form of engagement, that we are so invested in Saudi Arabian security that we have Green Berets on the ground, or we did at some point without the Pentagon acknowledging it to Congress. We are investing so much money and have essentially killed 250,000 people in Yemen and are starving millions more because of a few rocket attacks that have killed no one, by the way. That one casualty was the Saudis actually themselves attacking the person in an effort to try to, counteract the missiles the rockets that were being sent. And so no Saudi civilians have been killed by Yemenis. 250,000 Yemenis have been killed by Saudis in the U.S. No Emirati civilians have been killed. Obviously, there's no threat to any U.S. civilians. And also the Obama administration framed this as a defensive operation from the start, from the announcement that was made by the Obama White House in March of 2015. They said that we are defending Saudi territories and Saudi sovereignty. So if we're back to that framing now, then what's changed? If the entire past 6 years have been on the pretext of a defensive operation, then how can we all of a sudden say, no, actually now it's defensive and not offensive? So I think these are just, the Biden administration is playing with words here. It's trying to sell an idea. And it seems to be business as usual since that announcement was made in February.
I also want to echo that. I mean, since day one, which is March 26, 2015, every single day, the Saudis have been bombing Yemen. Think about that. Every single day, not a single day, whether under Obama, whether under Trump, whether under Biden. Yemeni are being bombed every single day since March 2015. And in terms of, what the Saudis are afraid of, for me, it doesn't make any sense. You are the aggressor. You're the one who started, bombing Yemen. You're the one who continued to bomb Yemen. You're the one who have a blockade on Yemen. And it's so hard to think of a poor country like Yemen being a threat to Saudi Arabia. The Yemeni did not start responding to some of these attacks until 2 or 3 years after the war started. And even when they send, whatever they are sending out, it's always targeting military bases. And so it's again, a country that is poor, that doesn't have any of the weapons that the Saudis have. And to think that it is a threat to a country like Saudi Arabia is just absurd.
I mean, we should flip it on its head, right? It's like Saudi Arabia sort of wants to assert dominance as a regional power, maybe more likely. And I would love to hear, from any of you. Let's complicate this a little bit. We hear the UAE and Saudi Arabia maybe, backing different factions of the anti-Houthi who are now even in conflict. How does this become stickier and messier when it becomes about this regional power grab?
Let me start on that. Yes, Saudi Arabia wants to have full control of Yemen. This is something they've been very open about it for the many years. Anytime a Yemeni president who wants to distance themselves or have some independence in Yemen, the Saudis have made sure that that doesn't happen. So they have been in total control of foreign policy in Yemen for many years. What they consider a threat, and I agree with you, Arun, is that when the Houthi took Sana'a, that's what they considered a threat, because then there was a sense that they're not going to listen to them and do as they wish, because they've controlled, throughout. Anybody who came to power had to yield to the Saudis, otherwise they made their lives very difficult inside Yemen. The Saudis have interest in Yemen for many reasons, but one of them is right now, which they have been actively pursuing, is the area in Al-Mahra. Al-Mahra is a governorate in Yemen, and they want to have their pipelines for, exporting oil through Al-Mahra, so they don't have to go through the Hormuz Strait. And this Al-Mahra does not have any Houthis, never had any Houthis. The Houthis were never there, yet the Saudis are building a military base there. They have closed the airport there and control the airport. So that's their interest right now, the immediate that had come out. In terms of the Emiratis have always had interest in controlling Yemeni ports. In the previous administration in Yemen, under Ali Abdullah Saleh, they had an agreement to develop Aden Port. Aden Port is actually a very strong competitor to Dubai's port because it's a natural port, and it's easier for ships to get in and out of it than to go in and out of Dubai. So they had an agreement that was spanning 100 years for them to develop Aden Port. But in actuality, once they had that agreement, they basically closed Aden Port. So Aden Port became very weak. And that's why we see with the closure of Hodeidah Port, Aden Port is not able, although it's a natural port that it can be very competitive in the region, is not even able to meet the needs of the Yemeni people. So during the Arab upspring, the Yemeni people insisted that agreement with the Emirati be broken. And so they were able to break the agreement, but unfortunately the war that started in 2015 gave them now more power in Aden. So not do they just control now the Aden port, they also control the Aden airport, they also control Socotra Island, and they are flying tourists to Socotra without the knowledge of the Yemeni government in exile. And they have even the visa that they use with them, it's a piece of paper that they print, allowing visitors that to go to Yemen, to Socotra, while we Yemeni cannot go to Socotra. They also control the port and an airport in Mukalla and Shabwa. So they have really seeded themselves and took control of major ports in Yemen.
And I would add that the other aspect of control is, they are building a base on an island in Bab el-Mandeb Strait. They are funding the Southern Transitional Council, which is actually makes no sense if they're saying that they're part of this coalition that is trying to reinstate the legitimate, president of Yemen. Why would you then fund and support and back a group that wants to secede from the union, which is the STC? It's the Southern Secessionist Movement. And the UAE has also been operating secret prisons in the south. There have been documented evidence of torture in those secret sites. They have led an assassination campaign in the south. And they hired mercenaries to do all of this work, of course. And they've gotten to say they've gotten away with saying that we pulled their troops out of Yemen, we're no longer involved in Yemen, whereas that only really meant that they no longer have physical boots on the ground in Yemen, but they're just expanded the mercenary use. And so there's not a lot of critical pushback, but their vision certainly seems to be different than Saudi Arabia, as Aisha just outlined.
Yeah, I think it's really unsurprising that obviously money, power, and resources are really the driving factor behind this violence. But of course, in our U.S. press, usually the aims of the U.S. and its allies are always cast in a light of, democracy, freedom, or self-defense. So this might be a question for you, Shireen, as you've, written a lot in some sort of alternative outlets. But how is the U.S. press dealing with this crisis? How are they either not acknowledging it, undercovering it, and even obscuring what's happening in the region?
It's been entirely shameful. And I really believe that if the war started under Trump, we wouldn't be talking right now. We, wouldn't have lasted so long. But the war started under Obama. And in many liberal outlets, there was this hesitancy, outright just denial that, Obama could be doing something that is unconstitutional, right? That is genocidal in Yemen. And so there was virtually no pushback in Congress, very little pushback during the Obama administration, and not enough press about what was going on. When you did hear about Yemen, you almost never heard that the U.S. was actively involved every step of the way from the very beginning. And so it just seemed like it was the civil war, that, the Saudis are just trying to involve themselves in the civil war and nothing else. And if there was any critical pushback against the U.S., it was very constrained to weapon sales and not every other way that the U.S. was involved. Under the Trump administration, there began to be more movement in Congress, and as a response, the press was also picking that up, but still never really enough. Like, we should have impeached our presidents on this, on committing a genocidal war on a country of 30 million people, and yet that was never discussed. It was always just an afterthought. So I think it's, I remember living through the Iraq War days and the press's complicity in kind of drumming up support for this argument that was deeply flawed. And there was a lot of reflection after that about where did we go wrong. And yet here we are again in 2015 to 2021, repeating the exact same mistake, not really pushing our elected officials. Not, it never came up in the campaign trail, for example, when Hillary and Trump were going against each other, and it very minimally came up in the campaign trail later. But I just think it's such a failure of mainstream sources. This is what you're tasked with. We have a free press in this country for a reason, and yet there was very little critical pushback. There was some. Recently, there was an amazing investigation by CNN, which confirmed that there's a blockade. Nerma al-Bagher, she essentially snuck into the country because she couldn't get visas from the Saudi-led coalition, and reported on the fuel blockade that is essentially shutting down hospitals. It's killing people. Think about all the ways that fuel is needed for society, for a country. And when confronted with this blockade, the Biden administration just said, no, there is no blockade. And so, again, like, we needed the press to do this years ago, right? And that investigation got the ball rolling on all of the work that Hassan's been able to do. He's been able to cite the CNN report. He's been able to show Congress that this is happening. Our government is involved in this way. But I just can't help to think that, where was this all these years ago? The blockade has been happening since 2015.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think we're coming up on time, but the last thing that I'd like to ask all three of you is just how, as Americans, as American activists, how can we support the work you're doing? So Aisha, I'd love to hear a little bit about what y'all do at the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Organization. And Hassan, if you can let us know, how we can talk to our representatives about the Yemen War Powers resolution and check if they're supporting it. What should Americans be advocating for? What should we be elevating and talking about?
And beyond, global solidarity that we're trying to forge here on the committee program.
Yes, good.
So Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation was established in 2017 with three objectives. The first objective was to increase awareness in the U.S. among politicians as well as the population about what's going on in Yemen. So we've been doing a lot of presentations to increase awareness. And the reason we wanted to do that is so people can call their representatives and call their senators and say, and call the administration and say, this is unacceptable, we should not be part of this war. So I would continue to ask people to do that. Please call your representatives and senators and the White House and tell them that we should not be part of a genocidal war. The second part of our work is provide relief in Yemen. And so we've been very fortunate, and the generosity of the American public, we've been able to provide a lot of activities and relief. We distribute food baskets to those who are in need, and we know without these food items, they are at high risk of famine. We also support educational program. We support medical programs. We support water programs. And so these are income generation activities because we want people to be able to do and earn their own income. So these are some of the programs, and please visit our website, yemenfoundation.org. The other thing that we are interested in is supporting a just peace in Yemen. And that's why working with Hassan, with Shireen, and many other activists is also very important for us, is to make sure that everybody is included in peace negotiations. And I actually do not think the U.S. is an impartial negotiator or mediator. We know it's with the Saudis. It have decided where it is going to be supporting and who is going to be supporting. So to think that the U.S. government, with Linda King, as a mediator for peace in Yemen is, for me, is suspect because they are not impartial. They've decided their side. So what I would like for people to pressure them, again, through a lot of the advocacy work, is to make sure that they are, when they mediate, they work with people like the Omanis who are real impartial in the region, and not continue to pretend that they are interested in peace when they're actually, supporting one side of the war. So these are some of the activities that we work on.
I would just add that you should just do what Aisha tells you to do, and that will get you pretty far, and Shireen as well. Everything that she just said, I think, is really important. People should, if they can, kick in a few bucks to Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation. Go to yemenfoundation.org and make sure that you're supporting her amazing work, both on the advocacy side, but also the humanitarian side. I think folks should ask their members of Congress, their rep and their 2 senators, to introduce a Yemen War Powers resolution. And it's actually a very simple process. You just take a piece of paper and you submit it to Ledge Council, and submit it to the parliamentarian. It's like one sheet of paper could help us end this war. And we just need to find one representative to call the question up and force a vote. And who's going to have the guts to make that happen? That's really all that we're talking about. I think, we got Ro Khanna on this before. He needs to be pushed. We got Senator Sanders on this before. He needs to be pushed. Representative Dingell, Pocan, Representative DeFazio, Senator Warren. They've all done a lot of work on Yemen under Trump. They need to do it under Biden as well, and not just statements and letters, but they need to push legislation. So I would say that's all critical. We've also set up a site, endtheblockade.com, that will generate an email to your member of Congress, and that's kind of the lowest rung there. It's just endtheblockade.com that can generate a letter to your member to say you want them to be vocal about the blockade.
And I just have to add that, for the American public or for the European public, there is no complexity here. The complexity, I think, sometimes gets in the way of people doing something about it, but it's a really simple story. You have some of the world's richest countries bombing a country that doesn't even have an air force, okay? And starving its civilians. Nowhere else in the world is a country entirely under blockade where they can't even get food or water. And so you have, diseases like cholera and, we're talking siege warfare here. We're not even talking anything we've seen in modern times. And so that's the simple story that we need to understand our role within that. Whatever happens in Yemen is up to the Yemenis. It's not up to us to solve the Yemenis' problems. It's up to Yemenis and Yemen to solve their own problems. It's up to us as citizens in free societies where we have representative governments to actually get our governments to stop doing these actions and, enabling the genocide of Yemeni people. So I think that's the most important story here. It takes a second to just call your senator, your representative, or, all these European countries continuing to sell weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. Like, we need to put an end to that as well. Because we're dealing with two of the most incompetent armies ever, the Saudis and the UAE. They don't manufacture any of the weapons, so they rely on imports. They don't train their own soldiers, so they rely on these army contracts from the US and the UK mostly. They don't even know how to choose their own targets. And so without the US, there is no genocidal war in Yemen. And I think that's what we need to focus on when we're advocating for an end to this war.
Thank you.
Yeah,
so
I was going to
much.
say thank you all so much for
go
telling
ahead, Arun.
this simple story so strongly, because I think, as we know, it's not certainly new, but using complexity as a blunt instrument with which to beat down things that seem obvious has been a playbook of power, for centuries. But yes, as Julia said, thank you all for coming on. Aisha, Shireen, Hassan, we really appreciate it. And I hope we'll have a chance to catch up with you with better news. Maybe?
Yes, thank you.
I hope so too. Thank you for having us.
Hi, so that was good. I have notes. Nomi's not
great.
the only one who can give notes around here.
Yeah, definitely.
One note. You have to turn the air conditioner off before it's like absolutely just barely go time, because otherwise, we won't necessarily know if we're hearing things correctly.
It's 100 degrees in DC right now. I only have my window unit. I have to leave it on until the last second. Do you see how greasy I'm getting?
I just want to give notes. Everyone's giving me notes, and I want to give other people notes, okay? So can I just give you a note?
Just give me a note. Give me a note about something other than my air conditioning.
Note nice earrings.
No nice earrings.
Note nice earrings, comma, nice
okay.
earrings.
I thought you were banning nice earrings.
There will be no nice earrings on this show.
Comite, comitato, comitiet, comiteto, carul, comiti, we yantwe, submiti, we committee.
We are back. Thank you so much for being with us on the committee program. We have a special segment now where we're going to talk to Lizz Winstead, who is a good friend of the show because she is a good friend of mine. We have known each other, I was thinking about this today, I think for about 7 or 8 years, something like this. But honestly, you feel like one of the people who I've known the longest. And we were comrades in arms. And Liz is, of course, a leading voice in the repro movement. And she is the leader of Abortion Access Force. Where can people find exactly what you're doing? Because I want to pivot away from that quickly, but it would be too important not to mention.
Yeah, I think you want to go find us at aafront.org. You can get all of your needs, your reproductive needs met there. And just follow us all over social, AA Front.
And you may not be able to get all of your needs done specifically by them. They are not medical provider. I think it's important to say that just because, who knows, Google, the search engines, you know how this works. It's no joke. So Liz is many things, but I want to talk to her today as the creator, the co-creator of The Daily Show, I think 25 years ago this year.
Yes, July 12th.
Which is, especially for our European friends, kind of the premier political satire program that rose in the Clinton era through the George W. Bush era and continues on today in different forms. But I do think when people think of it, they naturally think of, along with The West Wing, The Daily Show is sort of one of the hallmarks of the George W. Bush era, Jon Stewart, etc. But can you actually walk us backwards to the origin story? Because a man named Bill Clinton is president, and the relationship of the media with power, with the presidency, with the internet is different. So it's different. Why am I talking? Okay, I'm going to be quiet.
Well, the origin story was, it was fascinating because when we launched the show 25 years ago, we didn't live in the cable news landscape that we live in now, right? There was only CNN. And even CNN was sort of this barrage of garbage stories. You know, it was sort of the trial of the century of the week. You know, it was the OJ trial, and then there was the baby
OJ
shooting
era.
nanny.
Yeah.
And it was like, you know, there wasn't a whole lot of news happening. But what was happening in America was there were these hour-long news magazines dominated, and so did local news, right? So there was when we launched, there was 17 magazine shows doing sort of scare tactic stories that I think a lot of people are familiar with. Stories like your mattress, what you don't know might kill you. You know, like everything was just to terrify America. And then the local news was sort of like, if it bleeds, it leads. And so when I was doing stand-up, it was really important for me that the media was held as accountable as the people who were making the news, as far as like not telling people the story, not giving them information, really being fake news in a different way than we refer to it then. And so my stand-up, and I'd done one-woman shows sort of talking about it. I did a whole one-woman show just about the ruse of the first Gulf War in 1991. And so I had been talking about it for a long time. And so when Comedy Central, there was very few people doing actual political satire, and certainly not media criticism. So when Comedy Central decided they wanted to do a show, they tapped me and Madeline Smithberg, who has been a real veteran in working in late night shows and talk shows. She was the executive producer of Jon Stewart's first talk show. I was a segment producer there.
Mm-hmm.
And when that show got canceled, our bosses went over to Comedy Central and called us. And so they were like, we want to do a show that responds to the world. And that was what they said. And I was like, well, one thing I think is important is that...
Because that's a lot of material, the world.
Yeah,
It's good. It's a
I
smart
know,
idea.
right?
I can
So
see a
the-
producer likes this. Yeah.
Yeah, so my first brilliant idea was, let's call it The Daily Show, because it's on every day. So I immediately was shown to be the genius that, I am. But then I said, we should think about having it be a total satire and having the show look and feel exactly like the news. So if you turned it down, you think you were watching local news. And then when you turned it up, it would drip with satire. And we trust the audience enough to understand that we were mocking just the garbage that the regular news would lead with. And so when we launched, that's what we did. And here's what's unheard of. So in the entertainment world, normally what happens is they give you some money to do a test show. And then based on that test show, they'll let you know if you can do 5 episodes of a series, or 12, or maybe 24 if you're lucky. They said to us, and this is unheard of, we're going to give you a year to practice on the air and work the bugs out. And so we were like shocked. And I've only worked in a couple of TV shows at that point, and they were like, and you should be the head writer. And I was like, okay. So I walked in with some like mediocre white dude confidence, like, I'm just going to say yes and act like I know what I'm doing. But the staff was tiny. We only had 6 writers, and it was trial and error. A lot of it, it was following the news. And so as the news trends happened, so did we. One of the things that we made sure to do is to hire disgruntled news people, because people who are mad at the media,
Mm-hmm.
who actually want to do good media, were furious. I mean, Brian Unger, who was one of the original correspondents on The Daily Show, was doing On the Road with Charles Kuralt until they pulled him off to do, the OJ trial. And he's like, I'm a journalist. What are you doing to me? And so we lured a lot of editors and a lot of news producers to leave. And they would be like, I don't know if I want to. I was like, your business is a shithole. Leave it. Make fun of it. Hold it accountable. This is the best way you can. And we actually convinced people to do it, not really knowing whether or not they were going to have it was because once you decide you're going to crap on the industry you come from, going back there if you needed to would be hard. The good news is they didn't have to, and they could move on and do other cool things. But so that's kind of like how it all started.
And then when you were thinking about exactly the flavors of media you were trying to satirize, how did that go into decision-making about what the structure of the show would be and what you were looking for in a host?
Well, it was a real battle. I'll have to tell you that the network and the creatives battled, because they said they wanted a news show, but really they kind of wanted a wacky entertainment show that sort of lightly made fun of the news. And I was like, no, we're going to do a show that makes fun of the real horrible bad guys. And I said, you want to have celebrities on your show, then why make fun of them? Why not make fun of the horrible bad guys who are making terrible decisions around things that matter? In picking the host of the show, it was the one place that the network had their sights on somebody that they really wanted. And so the show didn't start out with Jon Stewart. The show started out with a guy named Craig Kilborn, who came from local news, and then he was at ESPN, and he was a little bit snarky. He was a little bit like...
he was a lot snarky.
Yeah, he was a lot snarky.
that was sort of the thing.
Yeah, his whole thing was snarky. And his whole thing was sort of being like, for the olds, Ted Baxter, kind of like, is this guy in on the joke, or is he an empty suit with a good haircut? And we never wanted to reveal to the audience which he was. And so he would read the prompter perfectly, and he would say things that, in that news anchor cadence, but they were just really fucked up. And he would just say things that just kept sounding like that. And I think that's what made it really fun, was keeping the audience guessing. And so when we launched the show, it was more like Colbert's original show on Comedy Central, where every single person was in character. We never broke. The correspondence never broke. And then when John took over, the show evolved, because when Craig left and John took over, you had the gift of somebody who was, in and of themselves, a really strong personality and could really serve as sort of the voice of the people, while the correspondents acted as the dolty media people. So when they would file their stories, and they would have like this kind of over-the-top Fox News take on something that was completely reasonable, John could play our voice. And so you could laugh back and forth with their idiocy and then John's brilliance. And I think it was a really good evolution of the show.
It's an evolution. In a way, it is also sort of a more familiar thing, because I think probably Saturday Night Live in the mid-'70s, with the kind of, commentary on the picture as it's going by, was probably more familiar to people than inhabiting the kind of the news space.
Yeah.
Although I think the evolution that is interesting is sort of that old style of news, that like Brian Unger absolutely just does so well in making fun of and inhabiting, did sort of become diminished in some ways versus, and not even cable news like the Colberts, but maybe even the Newsmaxes and InfoWars, and maybe some of those sort of worse actors are kind of these weird independent ones now. And now you'd make a WKRP in Naziville, would be the equivalent of the satire show if you're trying to tell that same story.
How do you satirize? I mean, I can't tell you how many times we do things now or I make jokes now and people are like, is that real? Are you kidding? Like, I literally made a joke about voter suppression in Georgia, where I said, I just tweeted, part of the new Georgia voter suppression bill is that in order to vote, you have to walk through checkpoint Charlie Daniels. And people are like, is that real? And I was like, no, there's no checkpoint Charlie Daniels. You guys, what?
That's not a thing.
It's not a thing. But people just are, I guess when you can legitimize that Hillary Clinton was running a pedophile ring in the basement of a pizza parlor in D.C.,
we got
anything goes, right? And so it makes it that much harder and that much trickier to satirize actual information instead of just trying to debunk all the BS that comes out.
But it makes me wonder if the kind of more direct commentary satire becomes less effective, because now it's just sort of explaining things, which of course only appeals to one side, etc. And less, I don't know, sort of doing more being in character, and just, I think, and this is the thing I want you to comment on, dabbling in fiction, which is something I don't see advocacy organizations doing other than occasionally, things that we work on together. Is it wouldn't it be better to pick a different battlefield rather than spending so much time debunking? And I think there's things that Abortion Access Front, as well as Lady Parts Justice, who is the forerunners, have done to kind of show, not tell, that do play into this.
Yeah, and and I think that
Yelp reviews, things like this.
I think laying out the garbage and then piling on top of it is how you do it. If you lay out a ridiculous theory, and you can sort of cite that theory, and then taking it to the next level of ridiculousness, or what a logical conclusion would be based on a conspiracy theory, and then realizing, oh, that could never happen because
it's jujitsu. You take the energy coming at you and you try to put it in the other direction because you can't really get in front of it.
Yeah, but it's really just a lot of it is the more that you see people fearing, the more that you can see that like logical people have kind of given up on the truth winning, and they're also terrified that the Americans have become so stupid that if you even make a joke, that somehow the other side will run with it and present it as truth, and then all of a sudden that's another thing we can battle. Because it's fascinating to run as you watch as the Daily Show grew. One of the the media didn't get better, right? And so what happened was when the Daily Show was popular, cable news was like, oh, what people want are funny graphics. And they're like, no, they want funny graphics from the satirical news show. What they want from you is to actually do the news. How about that? Is to put us out of business. I think everyone would enjoy that very much if you would actually do your jobs. And I go on those shows a lot. And the thing that is maddening is when you watch cable news and they decide to have both sides. If they lead with the liar, there's no both sides. They lead with somebody who's just gonna come up with tell their theory. They will filibuster. If the host is not skilled, you have 2 minutes to debunk something instead of then having any time at all to lay out what's true. So it's really a problem. And, using humor, you're right, constantly to just debunk without actually getting at the truth. And I think going back a minute, watching Obamacare was a classic example of how that played out. No one was ever really able to tell the truth of the steps that we were going to take to try to get actual health care and how that played out. And instead it was, all this garbage, death panels and all this stuff. And having just lost a sister this year to ALS and having to do a fundraiser because our healthcare system doesn't pay for care for somebody who has ALS, that is palliative care. That's what they call the death panels. And then you realize what they're talking about. And it's like, holy garbage. Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah. And I think even the sort of more classic sin that I do think sort of for someone my age, you sort of see happening over and over again is the Gulf War. The kind of just reselling of this thing over and over again. And every time something happens, you're like, this reminds me of that. This is, you said sort of some of that energy is what fueled your ideas to do the Daily Show. What were you working on at the time? And what was some of the more active and less satirical satire, let's say, more
at the time we launched the show
happening at the time? No, before, during the actual, rah, we're fighting a war. It's been a long time since we fought a war. It felt good.
Yeah.
Right? I remember everybody felt pretty good about it. And saying that you didn't feel good about it, you stuck out.
I mean, totally. And I not only did I stick out, it was an abrupt change for me. I was somebody who had done observational humor. I did a lot, I did some social issue stuff, especially around misogyny and patriarchy and sexism. And I didn't really bring a lot of politics to the table. But it was when the Gulf War happened, and I was on a blind date with this douchebag who shows up at the date wearing a Yankees hat and a Yankees jacket. And I was like,
nice.
Look, the guy is wearing 2 pieces of sports memorabilia. They're probably not going to go down on you. So this is going to be a one date thing. We're done, right? So the guy, we go to see La Dolce Vita, and he was annoyed because it was in black and white. And I just wouldn't let this date end. I should have just gone to the bathroom and never returned, but I did not. So after the date, he was like, do you want to go have a drink? And instead of saying no, I was like, okay, because I don't know why. And we went to a bar, and the Gulf War was on the TVs at the sports bar. And it was like, you know, they had a theme song, and they had graphics, and they had hot people standing on roofs and green lights. And I remember thinking to myself, with no like intention of being smart, of just saying, are they reporting on a war or trying to sell me a war? And 5 minutes later, my douchey date was like, this is so awesome. And I was like,
Right.
What is happening? That is happening all over America. If that's happening to this guy right here in New York City, that is the intended result, right? To sort of game out the war and make it feel like it's virtual and
Right.
take it out of it so
It's
that
manageable, it's away from you,
Yeah.
it's simple, it's a video game, and it'll be done and we'll win.
And
Yeah.
people forget that that Gulf War was the first time we had 24-hour news, which meant it was the first time that the war was on 24/7 in our living rooms. You know, people saw televised war during Vietnam, but this was the first time it was happening. And also, it was ratings gold for CNN.
Right, because
And
they were
so
prepared to do it.
when
Yeah.
the war wound down, they had to figure out a way to keep the emotions of people there. And that's why it immediately, like, people forget, as the war was winding down, all of a sudden Rodney King happened. And then CNN used that not as a teaching tool about race and about bigotry and about all of it, but as a way to keep us scared and to keep it going and to keep it going. And then that started just being this sort of permanent emotional space. And so, you know, when we finally launched The Daily Show, America was in a state of that. And then, so when we launched, it was just CNN. 3 weeks later, MSNBC launched. And then in October of that year, Fox launched. And so then all of a sudden we went from kind of satirizing local news and CNN's crazy.
This is when the hyper jump comes to, cable news is sort of the big league to make fun of.
Yes. And all of a sudden the desperation to fill 24 hours was so glaring that it made it easier. And, you know, the dirty secret, or maybe not so dirty secret, of The Daily Show is, if you just follow what you're satirizing, you don't have to dig deep for stories. You just report on what they're doing, and then you actually poke holes in their garbage and the way they do it. So it was really actually fun to have people rush to work every morning and be like, oh my God, they've just created this whole thing about, like, you know, when old people attack. Like, I'll never forget, there was some trend on CNN about elderly people who would attack other people.
I remember this.
And it's like, what are you talking about? So, yeah, it was just a lot. You know, or I'll never forget, they were doing, they used to ask the audience what they wanted to watch. And I'll never forget, I'm watching CNN, and they were like, you get to pick the story. Is it educating Afghani girls or bride caught in an elevator?
Elevator.
Yeah. And you're just like, oh my God, stop. You would be terrible parents, cable news, because your children's teeth would rot out because all you would do is feed them cupcakes with extra frosting.
Totally. Sometimes it's supposed to be a little boring.
Yeah. And maybe a little nutritious and healthy.
It occurs to me that it's sort of helpful, the order all these things happen, because when it is these sort of silly domestic issues, and where the satire can become, why are we putting this sort of, you know, false energy or something else, versus like running up against something patriotic that's happening. I mean, do you think being able to look at some of these domestic issues probably was helpful then, as opposed to an immediate, like, having to deal with like the second Gulf War?
I think it was helpful. And, you know, it's interesting because, like, you know, it was something that I had forgotten was, you know, when the Bill Clinton scandal happened, I read an article that somebody wrote, and I forgot. And they said The Daily Show was the only place that held Bill Clinton accountable and that didn't shit all over Monica Lewinsky, you know? And I remember we did a joke where it was like
And that's true.
Vernon Jordan became the chairman of the board of Revlon. And it was like, oh, that's perfect. A company that makes concealer and cover up, like, and people were mad. People were mad that we actually were like mad at Hillary for co-signing and mad at mad at all the people that took on this intern. Like, where's the power? Why do we not take down Bill Clinton? And, as we have become into this place that we are now with being a little bit more.
People have forgotten a lot of where exactly they were and some of the things that they've done.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah. And it's like, and I feel like people would always kind of try to sell women down the river. It still do, in order to preserve a sort of okay system that sort of worked for them, and women were doing it. And it was like, this system isn't working for you if part of how it works for you is that you're selling out the victims of patriarchy. So stop it.
Right. Well, what was the story actually where you were like doing it and, what ran up against what you were allowed to do? What was the actual line?
What's interesting is you never really
Which I'm sure people ask
line
a lot.
was.
Yeah.
You never really know what the line is, right? And so once you realize that sometimes the network didn't know too much, then you would just push it. Like this isn't particularly politically edgy, but at one point we had a joke that said George Bush had his head up Jerry Falwell's ass, and they were like, we can't say that. And I was like, okay. And then I go, can we say George Bush's tongue darting him? And they go, yes, because they obviously didn't know what it meant. And it's like a better joke. And it's just like,
that works. That works for me.
Yeah. So it was like, those were like hilarious victories where you were like, But one time we almost got yanked off the air in Philadelphia because there was some joke about the Shroud of Turin. They like found it. And then we were like, we made a joke about the shower curtain of Turin, and like the Catholics in Philadelphia went crazy and they were like, that's blasphemy and you can't do anything about the and we were like, wow, really? Okay. So there was always a line and some advertiser calling and being mad. And then like, the network was always just like never trusting me and super mad because I was always trying to push boundaries. And one of my favorite stories was, they always wanted to shove advertising sponsorship into the show. And sometimes I'd be like, okay. And sometimes I'd be like, no. And so I think it was an Applebee's kind of restaurant. I think it was Applebee's. And Applebee's wanted to sponsor this weather segment we had. And so they call me and they go, Applebee's wants to put money into the weather segment. And I said, I really don't think that's a good idea. And
You're like, I don't know if this is going to work out.
Yeah.
Let's be
And
honest
they were like,
you.
Liz, we're so sick of you like trying to dictate it. We need to make money in the show and you and your politics and we're going to do it and it's going to be good. And I was like, if you would just let me explain. And they said, you know what? Not this time. It's a lot of money and Applebee's wants to do it. So they didn't let me finish. And the reason that I was objecting to having Applebee's do the weather segment was the weather segment was called Don't Go There. And so they ran the ad, and for 30 seconds, there's a weather segment that says Applebee's, don't go there on the TV. And so you're like, sometimes you should listen to me because sometimes my objections may be benefiting you. Yeah.
That's hilarious.
I know,
And
but
sad.
like,
and all the things at once.
I know. And it's sort of one of those things where it's like, you kind of can never win. But the one thing that was pretty cool is, when you work for a network, they're going to say no a lot. And the way to survive it is make sure that your staff trusts that you'll fight for every joke. Because when they see you fighting for the jokes to get the stuff on the air, that's really interesting and smart. They know that if you lose battles, at least you fought, because there's really nothing that's more defeating than your head writer asking you to tame things down or saying, I don't want you to do that because it's too hard. I much rather
it's better.
I much rather have relationships with my team than a network executive who's going to go on and, probably be the president of the Animal Channel or something. And like, they don't care really, and so I was just like, I'm just going to fight as hard as I can to make the show that I want. And I would have to honestly say when I left there, it was fine, but I think that it was exhausting for them to have to deal with me. But it laid a path for John to stay in the political lane and grow that and make that better. Because had I acquiesced, it would have been a whole bunch of garbage entertainment news that wouldn't have had, we wouldn't be talking about the 25th anniversary of the garbage entertainment satire show. Because there have been many entertainment satire shows that have launched and that have failed.
The rise of the YouTube and all of the et cetera has, of course, fractured the landscape, given us the opportunity to do this show, where we do try to put on a show and also be informational. What are you thinking about now, taking lessons learned, et cetera? And, obviously you all have your Feminist Buzzkill podcast, which people can
and we're
find
launching
where?
a whole show. I mean, well, first of all, I should say, before we slide off
On
the Daily
YouTube.
Show, I should say
do it.
One thing that's pretty cool that's happening on July 19th is my co-creator Madeline Smithberg and I are doing an anniversary show of the Daily Show with the original cast on Rush Chicks.
Cool.
And that's going to be, we're the only people that can tell the story of how it really all came to be. And so that is something that everybody should definitely watch. July 19th, if you go to rushtix.com, you'll see it'll be up on the ads, and it's going to be, we're going to show old clips. We're going to converse with each of the correspondents. You're going to have a chance for Q&A. It's
Oh my God, just the video grain alone is worth the price of admission. It's talking about some 90s video. It's beautiful analog stuff.
Oh, let me tell you what, it's so good. And so then now we're going to be taking, we're going to be doing sort of this feminist, hilarious show on YouTube starting in the fall and late October called Feminist Buzzkills Live. And we're going to be breaking down the big stories around, especially reproductive health rights and justice, and just like garbage patriarchy as a whole, and interviewing people you never hear from, providers on the ground. And then we'll have comedy and music. It's going to be sort of like if The View was actually funny and did stories you cared about and would never consider having Meghan McCain sitting on a chair ever. So think of it that way.
We should do the panel. We should have just your gang on all at once so that everyone gets to meet them.
Oh,
and can decide if they want to subscribe.
Well, I think so. And it's cool because
See the chemistry.
It's a multi-generational show and multi-ethnic show, right? So it's like me, who's been around the block for 100 years and had 3 abortions. And then you have Moji Alawodel, who is this...
And she's white, folks. I don't want to shock anyone in the audience.
Hey, lady. Hi. And then Moji Alawodel, who is in her early 40s, who is a black woman who was born and raised in Harlem and has really incredible stories. And then a woman named Marie Khan, who is a South Asian woman who comes from Wisconsin, grew up in Janesville, Wisconsin, as the only, Pakistani person in Janesville, Wisconsin.
Oh, yeah.
And so she's 32. And so we have this really great cross-ethnic, cross-cultural, cross-age conversation from people who are activists fighting for different things that pour out of their souls and that are all hilarious and smart. And so, it's going to make for really good YouTubing.
We are excited, and I just want to, just before we go, say when Liz says independent providers, she's actually talking about like the hardworking independent reproductive clinics who actually do the yeoman's work of
They do.
healthcare
It's
under
kind of,
extraordinary
think of it as
conditions.
like your local...
And when you give your $5 to Planned Parenthood, that's not going there. Like, it's good. They're wonderful clinics Planned Parenthood is running, but this are people who just, there's only a very few organizations highlighting them, and they are the ones who really are in the trenches.
And they do the lion's share of abortion care in the United States.
Yeah,
and
no,
it's kind of like just supporting your local bookstore or supporting your local record store. These independent clinics are usually family owned.
They don't get confused about the mission.
And they're often the only people that provide care to the communities that they're in a really profound way. They're really dope. They're the ones who are doing trans care for rural people. They're the ones that are doing, like, a lot of them are doing yeoman's work, going into like rural communities and giving not just abortion care, but also just like some generalized care. They're incredible.
Medical organizing, you could even call it. Yeah,
100%.
it's important. Okay, we're going to talk about all that and more when you come back. Thank you so much, Liz Winstead.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, The Daily Show, 25th anniversary. Thank you so much for watching, and we will be right back.
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida. La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida. Sacrificarse hasta la muerte en los campos de batalla de todos los continentes del mundo.
Comite, Comitato, Comitiet, Comiteto, Karul, Comiti, We Yantwe, Submiti, We Committee.
Yada-dee, yada-doo, da-dee. Putting socks on the top of the stove. Oh, hey! I didn't see you there. I was actually just doing some laundry here before I leave Padua. I really like leaving a country with clean clothes. I like to actually come home with a suitcase full of clean clothes. This may sound odd, but when you travel a lot, it's extremely satisfying. I didn't prepare a reading for tonight. You know what, though? Julia sent over notes from what's going to be our agricultural episode, and I'm not saying it's going to put you to sleep, but maybe it'll help take the edge off the night. Okay, let's do that. All right. She was reading The End of Plenty, The Race to Feed a Crowded World by Joel K. Bourne Jr. Joel K. Bourne Jr. Appreciate you. The fundamental requirements of growing food grains haven't changed much in the past 10,000 years. Suitable soil, adequate fresh water, and a climate that food crops can endure. The first two are finite resources, showing their natural limits as we plow under the last available farmland and steadily drain our aquifers. A benign climate also seems a thing of the past. Though disappearing ice caps and horrific superstorms grab the headlines, the largest, most devastating impact of climate change will be on our ability to grow food. Agricultural experts are already seeing its effect on important crops. The heat wave that hit Europe in 2003 results in the deaths of 72,000 people, a headline-making climate tragedy. What most journalists missed, however, was the 20 to 36% plummet in grain and fruit yields that year from crops withered by the heat. In 2010, Russia, one of the world's largest exporters of wheat, lost a third of its crop thanks to the hottest summer since 1500. Back-to-back droughts in the United States during 2012 and 2013 were the worst since the 1950s, affecting over half the nation's farmland and costing more than $300 billion. That's $30 billion. As I always tell candidates, if you get something wrong, you fix it right then. You don't wait. You don't hope the press doesn't notice. You fix it right then. $30 billion. The drought-driven food price spikes during the 2012 season were the third to occur in the previous 4 years, and they continue to spur social unrest and violence around the world. Just as bread riots ignited the French Revolution, high food prices helped spur the Arab Spring. The scientific consensus is that we need to limit the rise of global average surface temperatures to 2 degrees Celsius to avoid world-altering climate change. In 2013, our emissions were on the scariest part. A broad review of climate change studies published by England's Royal Society, the oldest and a very prestigious scientific group in the world, concluded that a 4-degree Celsius increase would make half the world's current farmland unsuitable for agriculture. The ultimate irony is that agriculture, as currently practiced, is one of the greatest offenders, pumping out a third of the world's annual greenhouse gas emissions. We are literally farming ourselves out of food. We've actually been in this situation before, but it's not a comparison that gives any comfort. Anthropologists have long pondered why, in the 200,000-year history of Homo sapiens, it took so long to develop agriculture, which appeared on the planet only 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. Some anthropologists and climatologists now believe that growing crops actually may have been impossible during the previous interglacial periods because of weather extremes. Ice cores in Greenland and lakebed sediments in Europe and North America contain an incredibly detailed climate record of the last 200,000 years, showing large, abrupt spikes of warm, cold periods, wet and dry periods, some of which lasted only a decade or two. Disastrous floods, droughts, and windstorms were much more frequent before the relatively warm, wet, stable Holocene climate of the last 11,000 years that enabled farming to flourish. The not-so-subtle warning is that increased climate volatility caused by human-induced climate change could at some point end agriculture as we know it. And as one of my agronomy professors like to say, there can be no culture without agriculture. As I walked across the eroded fields of Malawi, and saw the effects of Punjab's pesticide, poisoned groundwater, and toward massive hog farms in China, the agronomist stirred within me. It became abundantly clear that 7.3 billion of us who share this incredible planet are intimately connected by our dependence on the soil, the waters, and the climate that feeds us. And unless we put forth a global effort to change our trajectory, these primal elements that have enabled our species to flourish and dominate the planet will not sustain us much longer. I think it's always, different when you look at things on a grand scale, on a small scale. And it is true that we can't imagine a different way of life than agriculture, right? Like 10,000 years may not be the million years of human history, but as far as any of us are concerned, it's more generations than we can even understand. And so it's hard to imagine something different. The same is definitely true of capitalism and the economy in which we live in now. These things that seem so present and so irretractable and so irreplaceable are tractable and replaceable. And with that, I wish you a good night. Let's replace it.